All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Bisi Orisamolu, and I'm a strategic partner manager at Google Play. So, my team works directly with top developers, helping them identify opportunities for growth. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic of genre expansion today and how developers have been using it to grow their audiences. And I'll be around for the rest of the day, so please find me and introduce yourself, and we can chat about this more if you have questions. So, let's start at the very beginning. Why are we seeing more genre crossover in the mobile games industry? And I actually want to start with this developer quote. It says, "We did a lot of modeling around the concept for a new game. And when we were evaluating games as just one genre, we came to the conclusion that we couldn't launch a game like that." And so, really, the essence of this quote is that developers need to think outside of the box when they're thinking about launching a new game profitably. And this is because growth is just becoming more difficult in the industry. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware that the mobile gaming industry experienced years of really strong growth. It was growing year over year in double digits. And then when we hit the pandemic, it had even new highs. And you can see in 2020 and 2021, the growth was strong in both downloads and consumer spend. And then 2022 happened, and growth slowed a little bit, especially in terms of spend. And then really last year, 2023, was the first year, basically since its inception, that the mobile gaming industry saw decline in both spend and downloads. So, like the quote on the previous slide showed, it's really difficult for new games to break into the market. And we're also hearing from developers that's really difficult for existing titles to continue to find growth. Despite that, there are certain categories that are overperforming others. And so when we look at play specifically, we see that there are a couple of categories that have really strong year over year growth. So let's take board, for example, had 91% year over year growth. However, when we zoom in, we see that there's a lot of variance by specific titles. So growth can't really be explained at the category level. What we can look at is some of the individual top performers. So those who are outperforming in terms of new hits being top of charts or having really strong KPIs. And when we look at those titles specifically, what we find is that they have a thing in common, and that's that they've really intentionally expanded beyond their genre. So first I want to define this for you. When I say genre expansion, I mean the integration of gameplay, monetization mechanics, and or aesthetics from that are customary of one genre into an app or game outside that genre. You might have heard it called genre crossover or hybridization, something in that vein. So, by a quick show of hands, how many people have heard of this before? Okay, great. So, this is not a new concept. It's been around for a long time. And in fact, there are entire subgenres that are created based on the mashing of two genres. What has really changed is the dynamics that are accelerating this trend. So, I started with some third party research just to confirm that this is happening beyond just Google Play. There's also a lot of Play proprietary data that confirms some of the things that were happening in the industry and also things we can look at the category and title level. For this, we also surveyed 500 mobile gamers in the US to understand from the user perspective why this is something that might be appealing to them. And then lastly, we talked to the experts. We talked to a number of developers across North America, APAC, EMEA. This is just a couple of them here, and it's everyone from indie developers running 1 to 2 titles to enterprise developers that have a suite of titles across all their portfolio. And through all that, we largely came to the conclusion that in the more competitive market where developers are struggling for growth, genre expansion really helps them address the CPI versus LTV equation. So when we think about growth, it in theory is very simple. It's how do we get as many users as possible and monetize them as best we can. And so when you've thought about growth, you've probably asked yourself a couple key questions. The first one, as I said, is how do we acquire as many users as possible? And so genre expansion really helps acquire a broader audience by broadening the funnel and bringing more players into the game. The second one is how do we keep those users engaged? And genre expansion again helps create more sophisticated game loops that keeps players engaged for longer. And then lastly is how do we turn our players into payers and or how do we upsell our buyers? And again, genre expansion really helps drive higher monetization. And so if you think of this as a funnel, then we can stop the very top of the funnel with acquisition. So the high level gains in these categories has some key elements. So for hyper casual, for example, it's known for having very broad audiences. Casual games have short gameplay loops. Mid-core games, high per user monetization, and hardcore games are known for being really complex and competitive. And so when I talk about hybridization, I mean I talk about games that are taking there are sit in one bucket and they take elements from another bucket in order to reap the benefits of that bucket. So, for example, a mid-core game that has really high per user monetization might incorporate elements of casual or even hyper casual to bring more users into the game. And actually, that's exactly what the 4X subgenre did. So, like I showed before, the industry was struggling for growth in 2023, and the 4X subgenre was not an exception. And they returned to growth at the end of last year because of a couple moves made by some key players in this subgenre. And what they really did was take an alternative approach to acquisition. So, first, they did really heavy experimentation and iteration of creative, running lots of tests to make sure they understood what would resonate with users and what would bring the most users into their game. Second is they incorporated casual mini games into gameplay. So 4X sits in either the mid-core or the hardcore bucket, depending on the title and depending on who you ask. And by incorporating some of these casual mini games, they gave non-4X players something to do in the game that they would enjoy. And lastly, they used those casual mini games in their ads and creative in order to draw more players into the game. And you can see some of the results in terms of having higher store listing conversion than some of their peers, having larger user bases, and then really broadening the funnel by bringing in younger users and users of different demographics, including females. And the reason that these results are so important is because it's really critical for new games to be able to scale. We've gone through many launches on Play in the past, in the 3 years that I've been there, and what we find is really key is that successful games are able to scale at launch. And the games that are high growth new titles have really prioritized user acquisition, even in the game development phase. So they understand where UA costs are attractive, and they start by deciding to build there. And then they run tests in the earliest stages of development to make sure they've proven out their concept and will really resonate with users. And games that haven't been successful or lower growth new titles, one of the things I talked about is wishing they'd run more UA tests on the concepts. So if you're operating under the assumption that you can build a really great product and then figure out how to market it to users, I would encourage you to shift your mindset to how can we use our marketing and UA capabilities to make sure we're building a game that we already know that users want. And this is a challenge that existing games are facing too. They're also trying to figure out how do we bring more players into our game. And when we talk to existing games, what we hear largely is that they're doing this through implementing new game modes and having more mini games. And there's some really clear advantages to this. One of the most obvious being that you can bring in more users and you can target really specific demographics with mini games. You can also use this to test new features and game modes before you build them out fully. And this is a great way to increase engagement. However, talking about developers, there are some pitfalls that you can fall into with mini games. The first one being that there might be a mismatch between UA and an early user experience, especially if you're using those mini games in your ads and creative. So make sure you're not dropping users into an experience that they are not expecting given your ads. The second is you shouldn't create gratuitous mini games just for the sake of having one. And so when things are really poorly integrated or the mini game seems like kind of an afterthought, it will not resonate with users. And the third is that mini games pull users away from the core game, which is often where the monetization happens. So make sure that you have a balance of the time the user spends in the mini game and the time they spend in core gameplay. And we heard that a lot from developers is that balance is really difficult. How do you take something from bucket 4 and make it appealing to players who usually play in bucket 2? And the good news is that many players are already playing across multiple genres. So this is survey data from 2022 across key markets, and it's showing that on average, users are playing games in 3 to 5 genres already. And when we talk to developers, they don't just say that they want to acquire more users. They say, we want to acquire more valuable users. And so in our most recent survey, we asked gamers, how many games are you playing and how many games are you spending in? And we specifically zoomed in on recent buyers. And you can see here that the recent buyers, about 40% of them were playing in 3 or more genres, and 20% of them were spending in 3 or more genres. And these users are so important because almost 100% of them were monthly active users, 2/3 of them were daily active users, and as I said, they're all 100% are self-reported buyers. And so these are your most engaged and your most valuable players. I talked earlier about how we're seeing declines in the market in terms of downloads, but when we talk to users, we find that there's still a quarter of them who are downloading 5+ new games every year, which is great. And there's also about 35% of them who are playing more games this year compared to last year. And there is still a 3% that have restarted or are playing for the first time. And so these are users that are really growing the pie. And so overall, we think it's still a positive story for new games who are trying to acquire more users, for existing games trying to acquire users, and for all games who are trying to increase engagement in terms of time spent in game. Okay, let's go further down the funnel into engagement. So you've acquired all these users. How can genre expansion help you keep them in game? And I want to start with retention because that's the metrics that a lot of developers were focused on. And we asked users, for the new games that you downloaded, what's the top reason that you've churned? And the top reason was repetitive gameplay. And so here again, genre expansion can really help retain users so that they become engaged. You can do this by making sure you have additional elements incorporated into standard gameplay to avoid repetition and really encourage your users to progress. And I want to zoom in on 2 subgenres that have done this really well. So match design is taking the match 3 mechanic and incorporating a design element into it. And then a lot of the, especially newer merge titles we're seeing, have really deep narrative or story elements. And you can see the results, and this is compared to just plain match 3 games, where they have really increased engagement in terms of minutes per DAO and sessions per DAO. And the reason that this works so well is because players are looking for a variety of things in gameplay. And so we asked players again, and we zoomed in on puzzle players specifically, what do you like about the games you spend time or money in? And some of the things I said were contradictory from, being relaxing and challenging, action and fun. And this really points to the fact that you have a really large player base, and when you integrate different components, then you can really serve all aspects of your player base. And you want to make sure that you keep them in your game rather than them going to a different game that offers them something that your game couldn't. All right, so you've acquired all these users and you've managed to keep them engaged. How can genre expansion really help you with monetization? And here we say the best way is to borrow from other places your players are already spending. And so this is looking at a play level, all match 3 players, their spend habits in terms of time and money. And the top bar is showing where else the player's playing. The second bar is showing what percent of spend and match they make up. And the last bar is showing how that spend relates to the category that's on the left. So let's take casino, for example. We see that 6% of match 3 players are also playing casino games, but they make up 16% of spend, so an outsized amount of spend. And relative to how much they spend in casino, they're spending about 2.5x in casino games. So if I was a developer and I looked at this, I would think, are there different genres that are monetizing my players more effectively than I am? And what can I learn from them and bring into my game? Because really, while you're trying to broaden your audience, you're also trying to maintain really strong monetization metrics. And so again, 2 subgenres that have done this really well. So the match 3 RPG subgenre, and we actually put match hybrid as just one category, including some of the categories I mentioned earlier. And you can see relative to match 3, they have really strong primary and secondary monetization metrics. because they've taken other elements that really help monetize those players well. Okay, you might say, this all sounds great. How can I use this to grow my game? And so we've gone through some best in class examples, but I also want to talk through how you might put this into action and think through putting this into your game. So, first, you need to start by identifying the areas where you want to grow your title. So, what key metrics are you trying to drive? Are there certain aspects where you might be lagging behind peers? What will really move the needle for you? And then you want to understand your users' habits in terms of where they spend their time and their money. Next, you want to make a plan. So figure out, what am I trying to do? Do I have the right people in place? If I'm trying to implement, some mid-core aspects, do I have experts in the room that know how to do that well? Then you want to move to the experimentation phase. And because no one gets this right the first time, you'll probably have to do a lot of iteration. So once you understand what your goals are, you need to really understand your players. And so when we talk to developers, they did that through focus groups, community channels, having forums, and understanding user reviews, as well as looking at some market analytics. And so a lot of the data I showed before was at a category level, but we as Play have also zoomed in at a title level and said, for certain game X, where else are these users spending their time and their money? And so this is a sample of what that has looked like in specific reports we've given to developers. And they've really used it to influence their roadmap and understand what other elements to add to their game. Now, as I mentioned before, the developers that have done this in the earliest stages of user development have seen a lot of success in this. And so when we think about understanding your users, you want to do that at the earliest stages of user acquisition. And again, we as Play have done that as early as a pre-registration phase, where we say, for this title and the users that are pre-registered, where else are those users specifically spending their time and their money? And sometimes it surprises developers, the information we come back with, but they're also able to pivot ahead of launch or build things into the early phases of their roadmap to make sure they're serving the users that they have. When you get to the experiment phase, that's when you can take advantage of some of Play's tools. And it was really great to hear from a lot of developers that they think that Play has some really robust tools to test. And some of the standouts here were store listing experience. There are developers that were running 50 to 60 experiments at a time for just one title and collecting a lot of useful data from that. And also developers that were using stage rollouts for new features before they scaled them fully to really understand how it would resonate with their user base. And in the last few minutes, I wanted to leave you with some top themes around successful implementation that we heard from developers. The first one, as I said before, is to really understand your players' motivations. Why are they playing your game? Why are they engaging? What is it that they want to see? The second is to create seamless integration. And so from developers that did this successfully, we heard that this is really hard. It's really hard to take A plus B and mash it together and have it be fluent and really resonate with players. The third is to test more. Testing is probably one of the most important things, the testing and iteration process, in order to really understand it and to really be able to analyze those results and then change your actions based on them. The fourth is to be thoughtful about how you market. So I talked about players in the Forex market using more casual ads, for people having specific strategies around marketing at launch, for people changing the way that they're listed on the Play Store. Be thoughtful about how you're marketed, because it influences the users you bring into your game. And then build on the success of your peers. As I said before, this is not something new. This is something that's been going on for years, and there are some really standouts who have done this really well. And so make sure you're playing their games, doing their research around what they're doing, and also talk to each other about what are some best practices. And I think everyone developer that we talked to agreed that this is something that's not going away. And so there are a lot of fads that have set the gaming industry. There are a lot of buzzwords and things that kind of die out after a bit. But because of some of the dynamics I shared earlier, the changing dynamics of the market, developers pretty much agreed that this is something that will be needed from new games that are coming to market. And there are some quotes, in terms of what this means, in terms of how players' expectations have changed, in terms of how tech has changed. But I think they can really be summed up with this one here that says, Genre expansion is the next phase of growth, and we're really just at the beginning.